Welcome everyone, this is Breakout Session 1, Track B of the Academic Libraries North Conference. Before we get started with the short papers, I'm just going to run through some housekeeping. If you have any questions for the presenters, please add these to the Q&A tab next to the chat on Hue below. No questions will be taken verbally, but your questions pasted in here will be passed on to the presenters after each talk. This whole session is being recorded. If you would like captions, you can turn them on yourself by clicking the CC button at the bottom of the stream window. We do ask all delegates to abide by the Code of Conduct, which can be accessed by the delegate brochure and the ALN website. So firstly, I'm going to hand over to Finlay McIntosh from the British Library for the short paper, Reconnecting People and Communities with Recordings and the Archive. Thank you, Finlay.
Okay, good afternoon everyone, and thank you Heather for the introduction. I'm Finlay McIntosh, and I'm the World and Traditional Music Data Protection and Rights Clearance Officer for the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project, which is a major audio digitisation and access project based at the British Library. Today I'll be talking a little bit about the work I do on the project, which is mainly conducting rights clearance for digitised world and traditional music recordings. This is with the aim that we can make them available online, so everybody can access them, engage with them, and use them for future research. Okay, so I will start by introducing the project and giving a brief explanation of copyright and rights clearance. I will look at the types of world and traditional music materials I deal with, thinking about some of the issues they raise, and then how the rights clearance process can address such issues. And then finally, I would like to share with you a few examples of the rights clearance we have already conducted, showing how we actually go about finding rights holders, and then what has come out of reconnecting them to their recordings. Overall, I hope to show that the process of seeking permissions is not just a way to make recordings available online, it's also a way to reconnect a diverse range of people and communities to their cultural materials in the archive. So the Unlocking Our Sound Heritage project is a 5-year project generously supported by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. In this project, the British Library, in conjunction with 10 partner organisations across the UK, are aiming to preserve and provide access to some of the most important, unique and at-risk audio recordings held in the country. The project was born in response to the threat physical audio items are facing, so both from physical degradation and as the means of playing them disappear from production. Global archival consensus is that we have approximately 10 years in which to save our sound collections by digitising them before they become unplayable and are effectively lost. Through the project, we have preserved a wide range of content, ranging from classical, pop and world and traditional music, to drama and literature recordings, oral history, radio, dialect and wildlife sounds. We also hope to make around 100,000 of these recordings freely accessible through the British Library website. We're in the final year of the project, and so far over 350,000 recordings have been fully preserved, with over 88,000 cleared for online access. The website where these recordings will be accessible is scheduled to launch early next year, but to keep up the project in the meantime, we welcome you to follow our Twitter account at BL Sound Heritage. So on the project, I'm a member of the Intellectual Property Rights team, and we are responsible for dealing with copyright and rights clearance. Copyright is a type of intellectual property that protects a creative work for its creators. So in its most basic sense, it gives the creators of a work, the rights holders, the right to copy it, which by extension prevents others from copying, exploiting or misusing the work. It's important to mention that audio recordings often contain multiple layers of rights and therefore rights holders. As you'll see in this diagram, an audio recording would contain the recording rights, which are held by the recordist, performance rights held by any interviewees or musicians or poets or any other performers. And then there could also be embedded rights, which would be held by script writers, lyricists, composers, or anyone who has created works that are featured on that recording. So my colleagues and I work out who all the rights holders to a recording are, and then we attempt to contact them to ask if they would be happy to grant permission to make the recording available online. As mentioned within the team, I have quite a unique role as I only work with world and traditional music recordings. These recordings were recorded all over the world, which also means that the rights holders I'm trying to contact are scattered across the globe. So one day I could be trying to contact shamans in the Amazon or hunter-gatherer tribes in Namibia, Buddhist monks in China, or even Morris dancers here in the UK. So the world and traditional music collections contain a wide and diverse array of content, ranging from recordings of concerts and festivals to interviews with musicians and lectures on various music-related topics. But a large proportion of the collections consist of ethnographic field recordings made by anthropologists or ethnomusicologists for research purposes. The content of these recordings could include anything from songs and instrumental music to stories, riddles, poetry, or even ceremonies, rituals, plays, and so on. Of course, we must be aware of the ethical issues these types of materials raise. The very fact that they've been made among traditional and Indigenous communities, removed from those contexts and later housed in a foreign institution like the British Library, gives them a culturally sensitive status. The ethnomusicologist Antti Seeger explains this further, mentioning that ethnomusicology and archives themselves are inextricably part of the colonial period. And the establishment of sound archives was part of an epoch that saw the consolidation of the mercantile and political expansion of Europe and the United States throughout the world. Although the motives may have been different in each case, there is no doubt that the material wealth, musical instruments, and recorded sounds of much of the world were accumulated in the Occident. Similarly, the music of the rural poor is preserved by and largely accessible to the middle-class urban populations. So one of the resulting issues from this is that, unfortunately, many of the people represented in these collections have little or no ongoing relationship with the materials or the archive after the act of recording. They effectively remain detached. There could be many reasons for this, but perhaps a recordist deposited the recordings in the library without consent from the performers, meaning that they won't know where these are located and will not be able to access them. This also means that access to them is lost for future generations within that community. And even if they do know where they are, access can be restricted by a whole host of other barriers, whether geographical, technological, linguistic, or social. Of course, not everyone lives in travelling distance to the British Library and can access the recordings in the reading rooms. And in some cases, certain people and groups may be hesitant to enter due to perceived social or educational distance. We could argue that the recordings are discoverable online, but navigating the library's catalogue would require a knowledge of English and an internet connection, which we cannot assume that everybody has. Over the last few decades, ethnomusicologists and the heritage sector have begun to understand the importance of addressing the issue of the colonial archive and the imbalance of access opportunities. And now many also see the benefits of reconnecting source communities to archived recordings to help address this. For example, the ethnomusicologist and sound curator Noel Lobley mentions that active engagement and application is required to ensure that local communities can access, engage with music field recordings. For they're the ones whose stories, conversations, and physical responses are best able to bring these recordings to life. It is precisely for this reason why we should be aiming to find members of the recorded communities, re-engage them with these recordings, and collaborate more closely with them. It would mitigate access issues and allow for these historic recordings to live and breathe again within the places they were taken from. It would allow source communities to pass on knowledge surrounding the recording's content, allowing us and the library's users to understand what they mean for the communities themselves. And most of all, it would allow these traditionally detached people and communities to have a long overdue say in how the archive manages and provides access to their cultural materials. In part, this would help to rebalance the power imbalances between the archive and those who feature in its collections. So given the various access barriers mentioned, it's unlikely that the people we want to collaborate will be able to come to us. We have to go to them. And institutions around the globe have set up a number of projects that aim to reconnect specific communities with their cultural materials held in archives. And they aim to collaborate with them to enable new understanding of these materials informed by local knowledge and cultural memory. For example, at the British Library, we have the True Echoes project, which uses digitizations of early wax cylinder recordings and reconnects them with communities across Australia and Oceania. They've recently launched their website, and so I encourage you to check it out through the QR code on the screen. However, I want to emphasise that at the start of our project, we did not actively set out to reconnect specific communities to these recordings. Unfortunately, we can't do this type of deep, sustained collaboration work given limitations on resource, the scope of the project, and not to mention the fact we are dealing with such a diverse array of communities. Although this is not our main aim, we have found that reconnecting people to these recordings has been a natural consequence of our rights clearance work. As we've been trying to find rights holders, we have realised that we're creating new relationships, either with the rights holders themselves, their descendants, or the wider communities involved. I would now like to go through 3 examples to show some of the things we have learned from these reconnections. So one of the collections we have digitised is the Paul Lashmark collection, which consists of recordings made by the investigative journalist Paul Lashmark on a trip to Xinjiang in 1988. On this trip, he also passed through the Hunza Valley and met a Pakistani musician named Housekeeping, who you will see pictured on your screen here. Lashmark recorded him playing various pieces on the Chitrali sitar and an unidentified type of flute. So here is just a quick little taste of Mr. Khan's playing. Just stop that there. So we hope to make these recordings available online, but to do so we would need to seek permission from all rights holders. With permission secured from Lashmark, we now had to find Housekeeping, but when somebody was recorded decades ago on the other side of the world, how do we even begin to try and find them, let alone contact them? As a starting point, we looked at the documentation and collated all the information we could find about the performer. Although there wasn't much, we did know a couple of things, that it was recorded on the 19th of May 1988 and at a specific hotel in Gilgit in northern Pakistan. We also listened to the recordings and heard Lashmark asking him a few questions. From this, we learned that Mr. Khan was from a small village named Altit and that he would travel around the area playing music for tourists. Armed with this information and a photo of Mr. Khan provided by Lashmark, we started to contact relevant people who may have known him. I contacted the hotel he was recorded at and the Altit Tourist Information Centre, but perhaps unsurprisingly we did not receive a response. Then we took our search online, where we came across a website dedicated to the history, culture and languages of Chitral that also hosted a lot of articles relating to Chitrali music. We thought it'd be a long shot, but we emailed the website's editor asking if he'd ever heard of Housekeeping or if he was even in contact with him. To my surprise, the next day when I opened my laptop, I was greeted by a number of emails from people saying that they knew him. Word had clearly spread fast among the Chitrali music community. I was told that Mr. Khan had passed away years ago, and because he never married, there would be no direct descendants we could contact. However, one of the people who responded to my emails was from Altit, the same village he was from, and he knew Mr. Khan had a nephew and kindly offered to put us in touch with him. The nephew, Mansur Khan Rajam, was happy to hear about the digitisation of these recordings and said that he and his family would be honoured to grant permission to share them more widely. Now that we were delighted by this news, and now that we're in touch, we grabbed the opportunity to ask him a few more questions about his uncle and the recordings. From our conversations, we learnt a few important things. Firstly, he told us that his uncle's name was spelled incorrectly. It was not Harakim as we had in all of our documentation, it was actually Harakin. We found out that the previously unidentified flute he plays is called the tutak, also known as the gabi. And importantly, Mansur told us what his uncle is performing on the recordings. It is the music of the Burusho people, and a group, an ethnic group indigenous to the valleys of Gilgit-Baltistan. This was particularly exciting because, to our knowledge, we do not have any other recordings of Burusho expression in the whole archive. We have now enriched the catalogue entries with these details, which creates more faithful descriptions and makes the material more discoverable. This just shows that reconnection can lead to finding out more information about recordings, and when the documentation we have is so thin, this is all the more important. So now I want to share another example from a collection that was recorded a bit closer to home, and because I am aware that most libraries and archives in the UK will not have lots of world and traditional music field recording collections. Perhaps more common are collections of British folk music, dialect recordings or oral histories. So this example is from the Fred Hamer collection, which is a British folk music collection recorded between 1950 and 1969 by the folklorist Fred Hamer, who you will see on your screens here. We assumed that we would not be able to contact many of the performers in this collection, partly because not many of them are necessarily well known, or at least beyond their own communities or villages, but also because these recordings were made quite a while ago, and the majority of performers will have since passed away. Another issue was that the rights holders' names were often only referred to in the documentation as Mrs. Smith or Mr. Brown, which makes narrowing down who the rights holder is all the more difficult. Although we did not have much information about the performers, fortunately most were recorded in small villages, and this gave us a really specific geographical area we could focus our searches on. With the help of parish councils, local history groups and village history buffs up and down the country, we managed to contact a lot more rights holders, or rather their descendants, than originally thought possible. One of the rights holders we were looking for was a Mr. Thompson, recorded in Langford, Bedfordshire, and here's a clip of him singing a song called The Old Clothes Shop, recorded in 1965.
My name is Ike Yankee, and I'm a man that's very well known. And in the city of Carlisle, I've a business of my own. I keep a large establishment, and my name is on the top. For we're doing a rattling business in the old clothes shop. Now our trousers from the corduroy unto the best between. We warrant every article to be free of the galloping breed. A man come in the other day, a waistcoat for to buy. Try this one on at 5 and 6, I'm sure it fits, says I. He tried it on, it fitted him well, now ain't we dirty good cop? For we're doing a rattling business in the old clothes shop.
So, as Mr. Thompson was recorded in Langford, I contacted Langford History Society, asking if they knew who he was. They posted my inquiry on Facebook, and a lady replied saying that she thought Mr. Thompson could be her grandfather. I got in touch with her and sent her the audio files in case she could confirm if it really was him. After listening to the recordings, she sent me this email. Hi Finlay, I've just listened to the recordings of Mr. Thompson that you sent, and I'm totally shocked to hear his voice after all these years. But yes, it is him. The songs I remember him singing were in exactly the same style. He would have been 68 when that was recorded, and he lived in the cobbler's cottage in the centre of the village. I'm very proud of him as he won the military medal in 1918 for bravery in the field whilst fighting in France. He was a cobbler by trade, but I do remember seeing his violin in a cupboard at the old house, so he was musical, as was my mum. I was 12 the last time I heard his voice, as he died in 1966, aged 73 at Bedford Hospital. His name was Herbert Charles Thompson, and I would be more than happy for you to use these recordings. Thank you so much. So as we see, many descendants had no idea these recordings had been archived or even existed in the first place, and for some being reconnected with their relatives' voices was quite an emotional experience. Although we tend to think of these recordings as being of historical value, this just shows that by taking them out of the archive and sharing them with the correct people, they can have a direct and profound impact today. They have the power to prompt reactions while surfacing new stories and memories. The final collection I would like to talk about is the Emmanuel Olivier collection, which contains over 2,600 recordings made between 1995 and 2001 by the French ethnomusicologist Emmanuel Olivier. The collection documents the musical repertoires of several groups of hunter-gatherers and pastoralists living in or near the Kalahari Desert Basin in Namibia. To give you an idea of some of the collection's content, I would like to share this example of a women's elephant song and dance, which was recorded among the Jutwansi in Shaoba village in the Nyenye Conservancy. I'll just stop that in the interest of time. So rights clearance on these recordings posed a number of challenges. Many rights holders were unidentified, or if they were, it would be difficult to locate them. This is partly due to language and technological barriers, but also because there's a Jutuan custom of inheriting names, which would make identifying exact performers impossible without additional help. Curators were also unsure if the collection's many recordings of ceremonies should be considered sensitive and not disseminated online. Given these issues, we thought it would be more appropriate to consult the wider communities about making these recordings available online. So with the help of academics who have previously collaborated with the respective communities, we sent a letter to the traditional authorities of two of the groups, the Jutwansi and the Nama Damara. The traditional authorities had two very different receptions to our proposals. Although the Jutwan Traditional Authority was more than happy for the recordings to be shared, the Nama Daman Traditional Authority was not, to the extent that they were shocked by our proposal. Despite appreciating that the original recordings had been digitised and that they had been recognised as the rightful owners to their content, they made it clear that they never gave permission for these to be deposited in the British Library in the first place, and thought it would be inappropriate for us to share these recordings. Our consultation also unearthed another historical issue. We were alerted to the fact that at the time of recording, an agreement had been made between the recordist and the Nama Damara that the recordings would be returned to them for their own use. Unfortunately, this was never honoured, and they have called for their recordings return ever since. They requested that we return the digitised copies to them, and so with the permission of the recordist, they were formally handed over to the Nama Daman Traditional Authority. The community were delighted to receive these, so much so that they even reconsidered their original decision not to grant permission. They decided that 5 recordings could be made available online, one representing each of the repertoire in the collection. This shows how conversations with communities can offer us valuable insight into how we handle their collections. Whereas in the past we may have had to make such decisions ourselves, conversation allowed for the recording communities to have a long overdue say and offer their opinions. Another exciting outcome from this conversation is that the Nama Daman Traditional Authority and the community are keen to promote greater understanding of the recordings, and they have agreed to write a blog post for the British Library Sound and Vision blog where they will introduce the recordings and document their return to the community. This is a great opportunity for them to present the recordings in the way they would like to see them presented, and readers of the blog will be able to understand the content not just from the recorder's point of view as a cultural outsider, but from that of the community itself. Hopefully this will help in the decolonisation effort and allow researchers and the general public to understand the meanings and values of the music for those who practice it. I believe this blog post is currently in the drafting stage, but I would encourage you to follow the British Library Sound and Vision blog and keep an eye out for its publication. So I hope I've shown that rights clearance is not just a way to make recordings available online, it's also a way to reconnect a diverse range of people and communities with their cultural materials and the archive. Firstly, through the rights clearance process, we make people aware of where these recordings are, and this extends beyond the rights holders themselves. As we saw in all 3 cases, although the performers had passed away, we managed to get in touch with their descendants or the wider communities. We also came into contact with many other relevant people, organisations and community groups for this process who also benefit from knowing where the recordings are. By making these recordings accessible online, it offers the opportunity for them to be used not just here in the UK, but by the recorded communities themselves, even if they are on the other side of the world. Although we still have to be realistic about how many people living in remote areas will actually be able to listen to them, this is a step in the right direction. And as we've seen, the reconnection process also provides a space for conversation. Sometimes this allows us to enrich our knowledge of the recordings where we have little documentation. Sometimes we hear reactions to hearing the recordings, which adds new dimensions to our understanding of them. And sometimes the complex histories of collections come to light, giving us a more acute understanding of the potentially sensitive nature for the communities who feature on them. Like we saw in the case of the Nama Damara, our conversations can spark collaboration, and this allows the communities to have input in how their traditions are managed and presented to the public. Finally, by reconnecting, we also establish clear lines of contact between the archive and those represented in its collections. This provides a foundation for future communication and collaboration. This is just a starting point, but with institutions pushing to digitise more of their physical materials and make them accessible online, we should hope that more of the people represented in them are included in the conversation. Thank you. Oh, okay. So I'm looking through the questions now. There's one from Ben. I mean, do we have much time? 1 minute. So one from Tim Proctor. Brilliant stuff. Thanks, Finlay. Roughly how long on average do you spend on each clearance quest? This is a very tricky one. World and traditional music collections can take a very long time. just to set up the kind of contacts to actually connect with people. But roughly we try and spend around 6 months on average on a collection. But usually we take on a lot of collections at the same time because most of that time is spent waiting for replies. So yeah, it can take a long time. And another question from Alexandra Mitchell. How have you documented the process you have been through to trace rights holders and the outcomes? So we conduct diligent searches for all the performers we look for. We mark it all down in spreadsheets. We include all the people we've contacted, all the information we've received from that. Unfortunately, not all the information we receive we can update in the catalogue entries, but usually we put things like the stories I've shared into blog posts or in social media to help share those messages. Okay, I think that's me finished. Okay, thanks for listening, everybody.
Thanks very much, Finlay. That was a really interesting talk. So I'm going to hand over now to Sally Dalton and Deirdre Andre from the University of Leeds for their short paper addressing racism and bias in the scholarly publishing industry during literature search training. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Heather. Finlay, you might have to stop sharing your screen. Oh, thank you. It just wasn't letting me do it. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Right, I'm hoping that you can all see that. Deirdre, can you just give me a nod if you can see? Yeah, okay, brilliant. Right, welcome to our presentation, everybody. My name is Sally and I'm going to be presenting with my colleague Deirdre today. We're from the Leeds University Library Research Support Team, and we're just going to be talking to you briefly today about how we address racism and other forms of discrimination in the scholarly publication industry when we're teaching literature searching. So the outline of our presentation. So I'm briefly going to talk about a little bit about our journey through this process. We're going to talk about the drivers for addressing these issues. So why have we done this? And then just go on to say why we think it's important to then talk about this in literature search and teaching. Why is it important for us to address these issues when we're talking about literature searching? We'll briefly tell you what we did, and then end the presentation saying how we can possibly measure the impact if we can or not. Also, just to acknowledge at this point that it is okay to feel discomfort talking about these things and these issues, and that's okay. You probably will feel challenged, and that's okay. All that we ask is that you treat each other with respect and kindness. And also just to acknowledge here that Deirdre and I are in no way experts in anti-racism or decolonisation. We're here to talk to you about what we've done in our sessions. We're not saying that it's the right way to do it. We're here to learn from you as well, but we're just here to share our experience. Okay, so briefly just talk about our journey. So I think the main thing to say here is that we're still learning. We're not experts, as I said, in anti-racism and the impacts that it has on people. And it's certainly not something that's happened overnight. I started thinking about these issues quite a few number of years ago, maybe like 5 years ago, thinking, oh, we need to start thinking about this and addressing these issues within our literature searching training. It took until last year to actually embed it within one of our sessions. So it hasn't just happened overnight. I've done quite a lot of reading on the topic of racism in the scholarly publication industry and in academia, and I think that's really important if you are going to talk about these issues, that you need to read up on this and be knowledgeable. But I've also tried to read up and learn myself about racism, about white supremacy, about white privilege, and this is one of the books that I read that I really recommend, by Layla Saad. It really helped me to think about my own white privilege, examine my own racist thoughts and behaviours, and help me think about how I can use my own white privilege in a way that's beneficial to everybody. I have felt challenged thinking and talking about these issues. I'm worried that I might say the wrong thing. I'm worried that people might say, well, why are you speaking for another group when they don't want you to? But ultimately, I shouldn't be centering this conversation around my feelings of discomfort. What I should be doing is using my privilege to amplify people's voices and share their perspectives. So that's what we're trying to do. But it's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight, is what we're trying to say. Okay, so what are some of the drivers for addressing these issues? So I've put some of the movements and initiatives on the screen here, and you probably know most, if not all, of these initiatives already. So I'm not going to go into details about these, but I've put some links on the slides if you do want to go away and find out more, but you probably know about these anyway. The one that I want to focus on is just the last couple, so decolonizing curriculum and decolonizing research. So I'm sure all your institutions are thinking about decolonizing curriculum. The Why is My Curriculum White project. So it's all linked to that decolonisation. So the decolonising curriculum is really about challenging those long-standing biases and omissions within the curriculum, and really thinking about how we can demand greater representation within our curriculum. And then the decolonising research is something that we're thinking about here at Leeds now. So going on from just decolonising the curriculum, but decolonising research. So this is about questioning the origins of research, the colonial legacies that are replicated within it, and really acknowledging those voices that have been silenced in the research process. And this is where I think literature searching really kind of links into this. When researchers are doing their own research, they will be doing literature searches to find other research to inform their research. And this is where we need to be acknowledging those voices that we may be missing when we're doing our literature searching because of these issues of racism and discrimination. So that's how I think this all kind of fits into these bigger issues. Okay. So now I'm going to ask you to do something. I want to know, what do you think are some of the potential biases and discrimination that you need to be aware of when searching for scholarly information? So I'd like you to use the chat box on Hubulo and just tell us if you can, when you're doing literature searching, have you thought about these issues of biases, discrimination? I put some questions to prompt you. You probably know where we're going with this because you know what this topic is of this session is about, but I'd be really interested to know if you have thought about any of these issues. So I'll just give you a minute. And I'm just going to stop sharing my slides so I can just see your answers. So are there any biases and discrimination that you think that we might need to be aware of or start thinking about when we're doing literature searching? I'm going to just give you another few seconds. Yeah, so I've got a couple of points in there. So think about the terminology or the language used. Yeah, bias from colonial perspective, publisher bias against researchers whose first language isn't English. Brilliant, thank you for those. And I keep putting them in there, and I will check after the session as well. I'm just going to go back to showing my slides. So this is actually the slide that we use to introduce this topic within our literature searching sessions. So within our session, we say that we're going to talk about, we're going to think about some of the potential biases that you might need to be aware of when you're doing your literature searching. And we ask the researchers, okay, what do you think those potential biases are? And researchers really engage with this topic in literature searching sessions. There isn't kind of an awkward silence. People do put ideas in the chat. We don't ever have anyone kind of saying explicitly, well, there's lots of racism within the scholarly publication industry and that can impact on the ability of some people to publish. We don't have people saying that, but we do get people picking up on some of the points that you put in the chat, particularly around English language bias. So it's quite a nice way to introduce it and get them to start thinking about some of these issues without us just telling them what they are. So once we've done this, we then go on to talk to them about some of these issues, some of those issues of racism and bias within the scholarly publication industry. So these aren't all of the issues. There's loads on this topic. There's loads of problems and issues. These are just a few of them. And I specifically haven't put links to this because I think if you do want to talk about this in your sessions, you need to go away and do a little bit of research and find that information online, and there's lots of people sharing their experiences of these issues. So there's lots to find there. But just briefly to cover these. So the top one is around the fact that leading journal editors of those kind of mainstream journals are edited by mostly white, Western or North American people. So they can really act as gatekeepers to what's published in their journals. So consciously or unconsciously, they can reinforce that exclusion of certain voices or perspectives within their journals. There's lots of evidence to show that researchers of colour get less access to research funding. They find it harder to get access to that research funding. So that leads us to think, okay, who is doing the research? Who's getting that funding to do that research, and who isn't? And whose perspectives and views are we missing? Are we excluding? Because those researchers can't get access to the funding to do their research. Research about people of colour or non-Western regions is more difficult to publish. Again, lots of people sharing their experiences online around this topic. So it's not that this research isn't getting done. It is. It's just harder for that research to get published in those mainstream journals. So if they aren't being published in those mainstream journals, how do we go and find that information? And also research originating from non-Western countries is scrutinised more rigorously. So it's held to a much more higher standard. So it's harder to get that information published. So if it's not in those mainstream journals, where are we looking for it? Where can we find it to make sure it's included in our literature search? And then thinking about kind of who accesses academia and who doesn't access academia, who finds it harder to access that. There's lots of information online about this, but one of the stats that I put on here is that Black students are much more likely to drop out of studying science than their white peers. So this obviously contributes to underrepresentation in academia and that issue of lack of diversity in academia. And before I hand over to Deirdre to talk a little bit more about what we did, this is another slide that we share within our literature searching sessions. It's a nice visual map showing analysing data in Scopus in 2017. I appreciate it's a bit out of date now, but I don't think it would change much. And the world is scaled by the authors from each country for the content in Scopus. So you can see that there's lots of articles in Scopus in 2017 from North America, from Europe, from China, but look at the South America, look at Africa region, that there's not as much in there. So it's not that these researchers from these regions aren't doing research, they are doing good research, it's just not getting into those journals that are indexed in Scopus and Web of Science. So if someone tells you they've done a comprehensive search when they're doing Scopus and Web of Science search, they've done a comprehensive search of maybe the Global North research, but not much else than that. So now I'm going to hand over to Deirdre.
So we want to think about, why do we need to talk about this when we're teaching literature searching? So these issues will affect what will be found when either we're doing a literature search or students or researchers are doing a literature search. And if it's harder for certain groups to publish their research in mainstream journals that are indexed in mainstream databases, then we need to think about looking elsewhere. And we need to be aware of what we might be missing and acknowledge this in our research. So over to you. We'd like to know from you, do you talk about any of these issues in your literature searching training? So if you do, how do you do it? Who do you do it with undergrads, researchers, staff? And if you do it, what has the impact of this has been? And if you're not doing it, then why? And what are the barriers to you doing it? We'd like if you to have a little think about it and share your thoughts in the chat. So is anybody doing this? Be interesting to know. Okay, so Ewan says not yet, but it's something to consider. So yeah, it's good to consider doing it. Anyone else doing it or not doing it? Or Alice, yeah, you try to get students to consider if all the literature is from the same pace or from certain demographics. But you're not sure if this approach is also taken by departments. Okay, so just coming back to what we actually did in practice. So we started talking about it in our literature searching sessions. We decided to redesign our literature searching session. So we're thinking about doing this anyway, as we, from evidence was showing and our experience with researchers was showing that the one-shot sessions weren't very effective. So we moved to a 2-session workshop program. It's important to say that we kind of did this as a webinar. So we were worried initially that PGRs wouldn't kind of attend a 2-session workshop because it was a webinar, was online and easy to access, especially for those who might not live locally or who didn't want to travel to the university. There was a high uptake of both sessions. So that basically gave us more time to cover these issues. We also developed a list of databases that focused on indexing research from around the world. And I'll ask Ben just to share this in the chat now. So this was added to our library catalogue. As well as this, we added relevant new resources from around the world to our list of subject-specific sources that are on our library website. So researchers in a certain discipline can see these extra resources when they look at list of resources available. So just measuring the impact of talking about biasm and racism in scholarly publication in our sessions. We don't know for definite yet, it's early days, but these are some of the comments we got when we asked PGRs what changes they plan to make to their practice as a result of us talking about it in the session. So it's heartening to see that they're thinking about using new resources and that they're sort of more vigilant about kind of potential biases in literature searching. So it's good to see that they at least are starting to think about it. So that's the end of our presentation. We'd be really interested for any questions you might have, or we'd like, if you want to talk about it after the session, we'd love to talk to you about it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Deirdre and Sally. So if anyone has any questions, please do pop them into the Q&A box. We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. Okay, if we've not got any questions, then we can finish off that session there. Like Sally and Deirdre said, they're happy to chat with people after the session if you do think of any questions. So thank you very much to Finlay, Deirdre and Sally for those really interesting talks in this slot today. Next up on the programme is a 15-minute lounge break where you can enter the lounges to chat with other delegates or go into our sponsor booths. And this is then followed at 3:15 by the sponsor presentation from our gold sponsor, Cortext. Do keep an eye out as well for the feedback survey, which will be coming around at the end of each day of the conference. So thanks very much again, everybody, and see you in another session.